Okay, so I wanted to do an update on the current situation. Things have evolved, not quite as I anticipated them, and of course, as things evolve, they get more confusing because there's more different things coming out of the woodwork. It started out fairly simple, seeming perspective of one side versus another kind of thing, and now we're seeing, of course, that there's a lot of sides forming up, and of course, that makes trying to predict the sorts of things we're likely to see a lot more difficult. So, sorry I haven't done a video in a while. I've been kind of busy doing doing various projects, including trying to do the well pump thing, which I hope will uh, come to some fruition here shortly. Also, I've been having some technical difficulties, some of which are being addressed, and hopefully I'll be back up and making videos pretty quickly and hopefully better. So, anyways, as I was saying, this is a situation where we've got all kinds of stuff going on. A lot of people now, the suppose the virus situation is rearing its head again, which was anticipated. And I said, hey, we'd start to see it in 2 to 4 weeks after coming out of quarantine. And depending on where you are, it's been somewhere between a week and about 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. And sure enough, right on schedule, they're starting to talk about, hey, it's coming back. Personally, I believe that it's too soon, and that a lot of these things saying that there's a sharp spike in cases surrounding the protests and stuff like that. There's something extremely hinky about it. It doesn't make sense. It's right off the pattern. The pattern that was established by the virus and has been seen in China twice, has been seen in India, has been seen in Iran and Italy and Germany and Spain and Russia and the United States and so forth. There is a certain established pattern. And while it's very hard to ascertain exactly what our situation is because all the numbers are garbage, at the same time, when something completely varies from that pattern, that very well-established pattern, it's got to raise your eyebrows a little bit. So we've got a situation here where, yes, it seems that things are coming back, though they're coming back in a way that doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. There's no reason to believe that the riots would have accelerated the spread, normal spread. People started saying that there were all kinds of virus issues as little as 3 days after riots started. And that is far too soon for them to possibly know. The soonest one is anticipated from catching the disease, being exposed to the disease to the first show of symptoms can be as little as 3 days. And theoretically, if it was extremely violent and aggressive version of the disease, a person could, in fact, go with it into the hospital almost immediately, but they would also almost immediately die if it's going that fast. That's the pattern that's been established all over the world. Normally speaking, exposure would take anywhere from 3 days to 14 days to show up, possibly longer, and then there would still be at least a week to 12 days of being sick before anyone would show up at the hospital looking to be tested. That is the pattern we have seen up until now consistently all over the world. So they're blaming things on the riots, and they're saying, within 3 days of the riots starting, they started to say, oh, well, there's this huge spike in COVID cases. We've already tested them. We've already identified it. That has got to be propaganda, hyperbole, or something else is going on there. Some other thing is going on there that meets the eye, or it's just plain a lie. It's made up. Not true. So I take this resurgence, at least at this point, with a little bit of a grain of salt, because it is not matching the pattern, and nowhere else has that pattern deviated. All of a sudden, here now it's deviating. This is strange, inexplicable, quite frankly. Even if one was to postulate that they deliberately salted the protest crowds with people they knew to be infected and deliberately exposed people to the COVID aggressively in order to spread sickness, which is a theory that some people have offered, Even if that was so, it would still proceed in the way we would expect it to proceed. Even if somebody was putting it in bottled water, or even if people were putting it in food, or even if people were spraying it in the air, or doing whatever it was to specifically contaminate people, it would still not deviate from its normal progression. And so when you see something like that deviate from its established progression, you've got to start asking certain questions. Not that I know what the answer is, but it definitely deviates. At the same time, people are making noise about that. Like I said, it's really too early to tell. The numbers can't be trusted in general. I'm waiting to hear things from on the street. Actual doctors, actual nurses, EMT, dispatch radio, which I'm still listening to. Things like that, I'm waiting to hear it reflected there. Personally, I think it's a little too early to know whether there's actually a spike in cases or not. And so, one has to take that under advisement. On the other hand, there's every reason to believe that, in fact, yes, we're going into another build-up round, probably even a little faster than it was anticipated. But that waits to see. Like I said, we'll know for sure by August 8th, one way or another. We should have a pretty good idea by July 4th. We should have a pretty good idea by August 8th. We should have a very clear idea of what actually is transpiring, provided we can trust anything at this point, which is by no means certain. So yeah, it's still a thing we have to deal with. It's definitely, there will be moves to put people back into lockdown. People barely got out of lockdown, and they will be trying to assert lockdown again. And of course, there's this whole fragmenting of the factions, that really still, economic issues are by far the most destructive issues that we face. And the economy just continues to print. I guess today they did pass in the House another bailout bill. I'm sure there's 10,000 riders on it that are all objectionable, so I very much doubt it'll pass the Senate, and I very much doubt it will hit the president's desk. So as long as they need to bail people out again. We're definitely in a printing hyperinflationary cycle economically. We're seeing now repo rates, repo bailouts overnight, basically overnight lending. The things that allow the banks to open again in the morning is entirely based on what's called short-term lending, overnight lending, and these are called repos. Now, the repo rates, right now they're putting in somewhere between $7 and $8 trillion every night. So, on books debt in the United States, which is not real debt. The real debt is considerably higher, but on books debt, they're basically putting in the entire debt of the total accumulated debt of the United States since the inception of the Federal Reserve Bank. They're putting that in just about every night now. So that definitely talk about printing. Now, admittedly, they theoretically get it back in the morning, but just to keep the banks opening up the next day, they've got to print the entire national debt every night and throw it at the banks. So that's some heavy-duty printing. The market continues to climb since everyone seems to rank the economy by the markets. We have this bogus employment number. They absolutely changed they moved the goalpost on that, which has been going on since mid-90s. And so it's nothing new. As every time things look really, really bad, they just change the way they figure things. And they changed the way they figured things again to make it look better than it was. It's actually quite disastrous. All they have left is printing. They will have to get money into people's hands somehow. So at some point, yes, there will be bailouts, most likely. Of course, these political tensions make that slow, or not, if not impossible. Frankly, if they don't get money into the hands of people consistently and in increasing quantities, the system will crash. That's just part and parcel of maintaining hyperinflation. You've got to get money into people's hands so they have the money to spend in ever-increasing quantities at ever faster rates. Things crash when you can't keep up. It's when the resources run out, or there's system destruction, or when you just can't print enough money fast enough to keep up with the hyperinflation. At some point there, the system, it fails, and that's when you have your actual crash. So, theoretically, we're some way out from the crash. We could be arguably as much as a year to 2 years out from the crash. One could argue. But if they are not able to get money into people's hands more effectively and faster, we could be as little as a few months away from the crash. And with the political tensions, that is more and more likely that we'll have a crash sooner rather than later. Meanwhile, of course, the Civil War has gone hot, the bureaucratic Civil War, and they have now put a mercenary army onto the street, which is feigning civil unrest. It's not legit. I said there was civil unrest coming, and I still believe there's civil unrest coming, even more so now. But the civil unrest that we've seen around this whole police officer issue is completely mocked up. This is all. It's not to say there aren't people who are duped and stupid enough to genuinely take this as at face value and enjoy and to partake in the theater of it. But it is theater, and it's paid for, and there's more and more evidence coming out that supports that it's false. It's that what happened is not what's being reported, and the people who have gotten violent are being paid to get violent, which includes cops dressed in full black who are fomenting the violence. So the cops are actually fomenting the violence against cops. And they're being paid to do it, which is typical of a strategy of a certain faction. So, of course, that doesn't, things have passed a certain point. They're not going back the other way. The die has been cast. Short of actually putting the military on the streets, it's going to be very difficult to obtain order again. The only other way to do it would be to cut off the finances. And then, because this is a paid-for thing, the violence is a paid-for thing, if they cut off the finances, it would just dry up and blow away. But then the question is, from whence are the finances, and just how effectively can they dry them up? We know that certainly there are certain parties, organizations, groups, Hollywood certainly is supporting this sort of stuff, but so is George Soros and the Open Society, and the UN and a lot of other people are kicking in money to cause this civil unrest, to make sure people are paid for being violent and for murdering people, for causing damage and destruction, and for killing people, which they are doing in increasing amounts. So, I think people have started to realize that, it doesn't matter what your political proclivity is, that you are, in fact, in danger. Because, quite frankly, more black people have been killed by this supposed black protest than the cops killed in the entire last year, and it's only getting worse. It's getting more aggressive, worse. So, obviously, they don't really give that much of a damn about black lives. And of course, now they're starting to drag people out of their cars and beat them up and put them in the hospital, kill them, what have you. So, the thing is, of course, one would like to think, and many people I think are thinking, that this whole civil war is going to be between two factions. Like I said, the status quo people versus the authoritarians, which is how I had been putting it. And to some extent that was for neatness sake, because it didn't really sum up the entire situation. But you make these things too complicated and nobody can follow what the hell's going on. But in fact, actually, I don't believe that I think that there is a fracturing of the factions, and I think it's going to become a compounding fracturing where, a group like, for instance, Antifa will probably spin off into 2 or 3 different groups. Black Lives Matter may spin off into 2 or 3 different groups. All kinds of different things. I think you're going to see more and more shattering as these groups cannot maintain their internal integrity or to agree with each other or function well with one another. They will find themselves constantly at war, even within themselves, until they all break apart into smaller and smaller groups towards being a group of one person, which is by no means a good survival strategy. So we are seeing this great fragmenting, this great fracturing. It's in other countries that have faced collapse, usually this stabilizes at some point. Groups actually manage to work together. Groups actually manage to carve out a territory and figure out some way to support themselves, and they become some new, kind of like what's happening in Seattle right now with Antifa, where they've cut out a little territory, and of course immediately found out that they can't possibly support themselves, that they're completely incapable of functioning. Very ill-considered activity that they engaged in, is extraordinarily weak position. But immediately they get a bunch of armed people to go around and, police. They create their own police, except for it's brown shirt thug police, and they start extorting from all the people and the businesses who are trapped in their little area. And so they're warlording it. And of course the thing with any warlord is that, if you don't have the resources coming in to maintain food and entertainment and recruit new people and train them and equip them and so on, if you don't have the means to do that, then you don't last. And so what they're finding out is that they can't really last, and it didn't take them but 2 to 3 days to go around and start extorting money by threat of violence from all the people. So this supposedly violence-free free zone and everything like that becomes ultra-violent and criminal instantly. The very opposite of what they claim that they were. What they always really were. They were always militant authoritarians. That was without question, but they claimed to be peaceful freedom fighters and so on, and they immediately become violent authoritarians, which is perfectly expected. And the thing is that, of course, the leader, within 2 days, the leader is accused of sexual harassment and chronic abuse, and posts a thing on Twitter about how they've got to go off and commit suicide because they're a chronic abuser and they're ever so sorry and stuff. So, even within the leadership, there's no mental cohesion, emotional cohesion. Individually, they are fractured people, and that's not going to hold the group together. That the group will not be able to hold itself together. They will fracture against one another at the drop of a hat. Maybe they'll find a strong leader that really unites everybody by, threat or violence or force or whatever. But most likely the group will just fracture. A lot of people have said, cut off the electricity and the internet and it'll all just go away, which is probably pretty true. And I personally don't think you need to cut off the electricity or the internet. You just have to wait another 4 or 5 days, maybe a week or two, and then it will fall apart. Especially if the virus actually is coming back, because these are the people who are out, not social distancing, not taking any precautions. They have no idea how to heal themselves. And so if things are going to be coming back, give it a few weeks, things will start coming back, and all of a sudden they will have to seek out medical assistance. Because they will just not be able to deal with it themselves. So, I'm not overly. I'm more concerned about what this represents as the initiation of a process that I think we're going to see spread beyond the single ideology and into many, many other ideologies. The catalyst was certainly Antifa and Black Lives Matter, but I don't think it's going to stop there by a long shot. And this is the disintegration of the United States. This is effectively political failure, and actually, there's the 5 stages of collapse that I've talked about that Dmitry Orlov postulated, and the fact that there was financial collapse, which we of course saw. That was the stock market dive, and now the endless printing. Then we have commercial collapse, which we've seen. Look at all the bare shelves that are still on all the shelves are getting more and more bare. And stores are being shut down and burned down and looted and emptied, and they're shutting down stores. Stores aren't opening back up and so on. So there's been a commercial collapse. Political was very dependent on all that, and so we're starting to see a political collapse. Of course, it's not nationwide yet, but it's starting to fracture all over the place as people failed to trust because of the response to the coronavirus and all the lies that were being told by both sides. Again, both sides of the authoritarians and the status quo people were both lying. None of them trusted the people with any actual information or any means to protect themselves. They constantly contradicted themselves and went back on their words. And even now they are flip-flopping and waffling about what you need to do and what you can do and what you should do. And they're hemming and hawing and fighting and showing no level of leadership. And so people are lost their faith in the government. So even though the government can still project its authority, at least theoretically, and probably will, unity is just not because they chose to continue to indulge in the culture of lies that has been around since the end of World War II, or since World War II, and arguably even before that. This culture of lies in America and in the West in general, they chose to maintain that, and it has broken the public trust. People realize now that you can't count on the cops to come bail you out. You can't count on the government to come bail you out. You can't count on anyone to actually be there to actually back you up. And you can't trust anyone to tell you the truth, and so forth and so on. So, of course, people are coming to their realizations at different rates. So some people would say, no, that's not happening yet. And other people were like, duh, yeah, I knew that years ago. So, people are waking up at different rates. So I think that, that is political failure. The political has now failed. In the same way the financial has failed, in the same way the commercial has failed, now the political has failed as well, in so much as it's not gone yet, but it's basically barely functional. And so, the government is unlikely to be able to project its authority effectively, any more than the stores are able to fill their shelves effectively, any more than the banks are able to make loans effectively. They're all still there. They're all still hobbling along, and they haven't completely disappeared yet, but they're basically non-functional. And so right in front of us, our eyes, we're seeing all these institutions, because that's the next level of collapse, is institutional, is spontaneous groups that existed come into a prominent role as they try to warlord and take over. And new groups pop up out of the woodwork and exert themselves in that field, and they vie for dominance. And then, of course, the question is, can they maintain themselves? And like I said, we're seeing in Seattle right now with Antifa that no, they can't maintain themselves at all. They're completely incompetent and inept at maintaining themselves. And I think we'll find out that the same is true of a lot of other groups, including a lot of the biker gangs and a lot of the street gangs and a lot of the militias and a lot of the other groups that are also at least making noise about going in a similar direction. They won't be able to maintain themselves any better than Antifa. Maybe a little better, because Antifa is just completely stacked with idiots. But they'll be able to support themselves maybe a little better, but only marginally better. So I believe we're seeing now that we are entering into the institutional or group or tribal stage. And the tribal stage is forming up and almost collapsing as soon as it forms up. And of course, after that is familial collapse. So we'll see whether families hold together or not. We may be as little as a few months away from seeing whether people can maintain themselves as families, if we haven't already collapsed that way. So at least for the moment, as we wait to see whether or not the virus actually is coming back and how bad it's going to be, I suspect it's going to be rather bad. I expect that that all this rioting and so on has pushed things forward in an aggressive way that wouldn't have existed otherwise. And so this one's going to be a much harder hit. It was never my opinion that the virus had gone anywhere. There is no reason to believe that it had, and a lot of reasons to believe it hadn't. And while I don't believe the numbers for any moment, I do believe that there's good reason to believe that this is going to be a much harder hit this time. So also then we have to concern ourselves with what does that look like when the political system fails, because we like I said, this is still kind of your respite where you have time to prepare for round two, and you're rapidly running out of time. And so what does round two look like? Well, it's not just I don't believe there will be lockdowns and quarantines in places where some faction can exert their authority. Now, it's going to be increasingly difficult, because you look at some place like New York City, and they could put cops on the street to keep everybody in the houses the first time around, and now they're talking about defunding their cops. So how are you going to keep people in their houses? So even in a place that was one of the most aggressive about locking people in their houses, they depended on the cops in order to enforce that, and now they want to defund the cops, which means they won't be able to enforce quarantine at all. So even though they may demand and insist on quarantine, their ability to project their authority and actually be successful in maintaining quarantines has been undermined by their own hubris. And so that makes it really difficult. Same thing with a lot of other places such as Chicago and Detroit and so forth. Places that are more likely to be harder hit are going to actually undermine their own capacity to respond to a second round of emergency. As well as the fact that a lot of people are fed up and they're not going to listen anyhow. And so there was going to be, that was where the civil rest, that's the organic civil rest, is people who just, they're tired of being lied to, they don't know what's going on, they don't know what the truth is, they don't even know how to go get the truth, that the whole confidence has been shattered and the entire system runs on confidence. And therefore they weren't going to listen no matter what. Even if people were dying in the street all around them, it would take a great effort for them to actually exert any level of confidence at that point to want to cooperate. So now, though, as we see these things, we're seeing things break down a lot further. We can't really anymore just say authoritarian and status quo, even though those still are probably the two big movers. Now we have to break that down a little bit more. So of the authoritarians, now we are seeing people come out, and we are still seeing the liberal communists that are authoritarian. And that, of course, that's very obvious. The progressives, the liberals, the Democrat Party, and so forth and so on. But now we're also seeing the conservative fascist authoritarians start to show their face in the form of generals in the Pentagon and members of the military-industrial complex who have kind of ruled the roost, at least mostly or partly, since the end of World War II. They are truly the fascists. They're the real fascists, the status quoers, the Bushes, everything going back to World War II, particularly the conservative side, but also the Democrat side. But the military-industrial complex generally tends to shade towards the conservative side. That's the neoconservatives. It's all these sorts of people. War for profit, using banking as a weapon, and all these sorts of things. Those people are the fascists, using a definition of fascism, which it is the merging of governmental and commercial powers into a single unit, and that's primarily the military. And it's usually the upper echelons. I'm not saying it's individual veterans. I'm saying it's the upper echelons that sell weapons and create conflicts and so on. They're the true fascists, and they're now coming out and showing their own faction. As before, it was very easy to see the progressives and the liberals versus Trump. Well, now we see that the generals are starting to stand up, and they're not necessarily pro-Democrat. They're pro-military-industrial complex and anti-Trump. So we're seeing a second authoritarian because they're perfectly willing to enslave people and kill people and genocide, and that's really, the thing that joins both these groups is they're generally genocidal. That's their modus operandi. Their answer is lock people up and kill them, enslave them or kill them, and that's generally their answer towards everything. Equally, the status quo people are now also splitting into two groups. There's the nationalists, that includes somebody like Trump, and then there's the internationalists. So there's a lot of companies that have been knocked out of China, and they don't want to come back to the United States, and they don't want to shrink in that way. They want the same world structure that existed prior to the financial collapse and the onset of the virus. But they're just trying to move their operations to India or to other Asian countries or to Africa. And so the internationalists want to maintain this sort of just-in-time delivery system based on slave labor in third world countries. And everything that was there back in December, they want it back. And so they're not moving towards shoring up any one nation. They're moving towards building up, just moving the industry from China to somewhere else where they can get cheap labor. Meanwhile, you have the Trump team, who are the nationalists, and of course they are pretty self-explanatory. And the byword of all these people is going to be law and order. So, as much as these are, the authoritarians, there is slavery, prison camps, genocide, kill people, imprison people, dominate people, so forth and so on. That's their basically MO. The names of these is law and order, law and order, law and order, but one side's going to be talking about international orders and international trade and open borders and ease of trade and being able to bring in cheap labor and so on and so on. And other ones will be talking about building up the nation and that the nation has to be strong once again and that we can't depend on foreign powers and so on. And so there's actually a battle between the status quoers. As much as there's a battle between the authoritarians, because the fascists don't like the communists don't like the fascists, but neither of them like the nationalists, and neither of them actually necessarily like the internationalists. At the same time, the internationalists don't like the nationalists don't like the internationalists. So one couldn't say they're on each other's side. They're by issue as convenient, but it's starting to break out into different factions. We also have the dispossessed, which includes the government dependent, people who are entirely dependent on government checks and so on. They have no means of life otherwise, and they're starting to wonder how they're going to survive in this situation. They're kind of scared, and they're getting angry, and a lot of these people are feeding into, being used and funneled into the terrorist activities that we'll get to in a moment. But there's also the small business people and the people who work for a small business, and that they were dispossessed by this shutdown and quarantine and the virus, and they are now starting to wonder how are they going to survive. They can't maintain their mortgage. They're getting foreclosed on. They're losing their vehicles. They're losing their livelihoods. They're losing everything, and they're very, very angry, and they don't see anyone moving to particularly help them in any way, or even acknowledging that they exist. And these people are getting genuinely irate, and of course that was happening before. That's where I figured the social unrest was actually, all things being equal, the civil unrest would probably come from the dispossessed. It would come from the inner city government dependent who just are desperate because they're seeing the stores. These people are very dependent upon single stores. So whether it's a small grocery store or a Walmart, Costco, that sort of thing, or whether it's a convenience store or whether it's restaurants, fast food restaurants and so on, because they have no grocery store at all. And all they have is a convenience store or maybe a fast food restaurant, and they get a lot of their food from that place. And these things are being shut down because of quarantine and stuff, and so they don't even have food. They don't have the capacity to feed themselves. They don't have the capacity to provide for themselves. And now, of course, with the riots and everything, the stores they depend on are being utterly burned down, and they're the only place they had to shop. There's this woman, and she was saying, they've burned down the only place I had to shop. They burned it down, and now I have nowhere to shop. And that was the story of one woman, but that's by no means the story of one woman. That is the story of millions of people, many, many millions of people. So she happened to be on camera. And people chose to react to that woman who happened to be on camera. But believe me, that is the story of millions of people. And many of these people are irate, not just irate at the government for the situation, the reaction to the virus and the collapse of the economy, as well as long-standing oppression and so on. But they're angry. They're angry at the terrorists because they burned down the inner city. So they're angry at the authoritarians. They're angry at the status quo. They're angry at the terrorists. So they're going to be angry at everybody. And so, they're going to, at least some amongst them, are going to be an interesting role that we will see unfurl in this, where they may be rioting, but they're not necessarily going to be on the terrorist side. They may be counter-rioting. So the BLM and Antifa may be rioting and breaking stuff and so on. And you will see other people, just regular people, who are dispossessed in those neighborhoods, coming out and beating the snot out of Antifa and BLM, not for the government, not for the sake of the Constitution, not for the sake of the status quo, not for nationalism, not for Trump, not for anybody, for their own sake, because those people are screwing up, the BLM and Antifa are screwing up their neighborhood, and they've had enough and they can't take it anymore, and so they're going to lash out. There's a lot of the authoritarians who are behind the terrorism they figure they can grab these people and usurp them. I don't think that's true. And I definitely don't think the small business people, I don't think that they're going to play ball. They're going to get very angry as well. Though admittedly, small business people are more likely to actually go and protest at a state house or whatever. Admittedly, if the small business people decide to peacefully protest outside the Capitol building, they will quickly be attacked by the terrorists as white people or white privileged people and so on. And so they're going to feel the need to defend themselves, to arm themselves. Otherwise, they're just going to feel more and more isolated and driven more and more to some level of extremity. Of course, again, we have the terrorists. The terrorists are showing up in the form of the communists who are being paid for and fermented by the liberal communists, are pushing Antifa, BLM, open society, and so on and so on. But we also have totalitarian groups, racist groups, and religious groups that feel that they should be in charge, that their opinion should be enforced upon everybody else because it is a divine opinion or the right opinion, whether it be one race is dominant over another, and every race has their totalitarian racial superiorists. There's people who are saying Native Americans, Asians, blacks, whatever you may, Pacific Islanders, white people, whatever. There are people amongst every group, every subgroup who feels that they are genetically superior to all the other groups. And in some cases, in some groups, it's much more aggressive than in other groups. But there's groups in every race has some feeling of superiority, or at least people within it that have some feeling of superiority. And so they're going to actually be coming up here too. You're going to see them lashing out against the Antifa and BLM. You're going to be seeing people of various religious persuasions, from various types of Jewish people to, of course, obviously the Muslims, to, of course, militant Christians, who are aggressive in their way and feel that this is their time, that this is their time to take over. Every group, the Jews, the Muslims, the Christians, the whatever, will feel that this is their time to take over the world, or at least to carve out their own little society and establish religious law above civil law or whatever. And so these people are starting to rear their heads too. So as we get the communist, Antifa, BLM, open society people coming out and tearing down statues and throwing bricks and stuff, we're starting to hear a lot of noise from whoever believes that they have a divine right to their superiority. Also start to make noise. And believe me, these people actually are not, even despite what the media says, these are not nationalists. They despise Trump. They absolutely and utterly despise Trump. They despise the internationalists. They may actually be on the conservative fascist side. They generally despise the liberal communists. And they may or may not be on the conservative fascist side. But they will be coming out on their own side and forming up all kinds of factions and carving out their own little territories and rioting and counter-rioting in their own right. And we have the true believers, who are the people, the pseudo-intellectuals, the progressive pseudo-intellectuals who listen to CNN and stuff like that, and college kids, and people like that who believe whatever they were told, that no actual thought shall break their mind or bend it even for a moment. They are true believers in the progressivism or whatever they've been taught, and are incapable of thought. And of course, these people are going right along with the, Antifa is actually anti-fascist, and they don't understand that they're communists, even though Antifa themselves says, yeah, of course we're communists. We want a communist revolution. This is a communist revolution. They all started to wear red now. They're using red flags, and this is a red revolution. And so they're coming out increasingly openly as a communist force, but the true believers who have been indoctrinated, they say, nope, they're anti-fascists, and Trump's a fascist. No, Trump's not a fascist. The neocons are the fascists, by definition. Also, you got the constitutionalists, people who, haven't read the Constitution, don't know the Constitution, couldn't quote a line from the Constitution, couldn't tell you what the Fourth Amendment was, or the Sixth Amendment, or the 10th Amendment, or any other amendment. They don't know. But they've been trained Constitution, Constitution, Constitution. and they have no idea, and this might include different groups, like a lot of cops who believe that they're defending the Constitution when they're absolutely violating it, and a lot of other supposed militias and so on. And I've been around those people. In my primitive skills training, I have trained with some of those people. I've trained some of those people, and I can tell you that their knowledge of the Constitution sucks. And that they're not, they talk a good game, but they don't live up to it. They are true believers, but they don't even. I mean, it's like religious people who they believe in Jesus and the Bible, but they never actually read the Bible. Or they quote the Bible, but they have no idea what the quotes mean or anything else about it. And so a lot of the constitutionalists are that way too. But of course, they're stirring up because they felt their constitutional rights were violated because of the reaction to the virus, and so the constitutionalists are up in arms. And of course, they're seeing the destruction of the whole system, and so they feel they need to respond to it, especially against the communists. The constitutionalists want to go particularly against the communist pseudo-intellectuals. There is some crossover between the racist groups and the totalitarian groups with the constitutionalists, but not 100%. A lot of people would say that's 100% crossover, and that is not true. Not true in any way, shape, or form. There's some crossover with the small business people, but not entirely. These people will be going out to try to defend the Constitution and defend a thing that doesn't exist anymore. And they don't even understand what the hell it is or why it exists or anything about it. And of course, there's organized crime. There's biker gangs. There's cops, because actually quite a few police departments are in fact organized crime. They are legal organized crime or legally protected organized criminal groups. Not all departments are that way, but especially like rural cops and sheriff's departments, a lot of them are organized crime. Quite a lot of them are organized crime. They own their cities. They run their cities. They run all the crime in their cities. You've got the Bloods and the Crips and so on, who are starting to carve out territory in the cities and defend it against the Antifa and BLM and the people who are rioting. They're defending it against them, actually working with the cops to defend their cities against Antifa and so on. So normally you would consider these people at odds with one another, constantly fighting one another, and in fact they are united in their fight against Antifa. And same thing now with the bikers too, is the bikers aren't necessarily working with the cops, but the cops would probably be leaving the bikers alone because the bikers are fighting their common enemy. And so these organized crime groups may all merge, and you may actually see cops and former cops working absolutely 100% alongside with various drug gangs and with other organized crime elements and with biker gangs and so on, and working in absolute concert one with the other. And of course, then you've got people like me who are just like, trying to understand what's going on and trying to innovate and understanding that, again, none of these people, where do I fit in here? None of these people. I am none of these people. I'm not on the list because there ain't very many people like me. I'm more or less on nature's side, and absolutely nobody's really on nature's side. Damn few people. I'm on spirit's side, and very few people are on spirit's side. In fact, in the West, most people don't even know what the hell that means. They think that means religion. It's not religion. It's spirituality, which is different. And they wouldn't even claim that spirituality could be different, but it is. So I'm not on here. I don't even know what I would call myself. I have no real... I have a certain amount of tolerance for some of these groups. At least I consider like organized crime is actually a fairly honest group of people. They at least put themselves forward for exactly what they are. As far as most of the rest of these people, I don't have not much faith or hope in them. Admittedly, if we're going to have a unified society, I would rather have a defined list of rights. I think that is the most civilized way to function and behave. Of course, we know that our society hasn't been really super strict about enforcing everybody's supposed rights in the first place. And if you aren't being strict about enforcing rights, do you really have rights anyways? So one can say, oh, but we have rights. Have we ever really had rights? You have rights until somebody takes them away, at which point, where'd your rights go? So you can believe in rights right up until the point that you're abused, right up to the point that somebody proposes to take away your freedom and liberty with absolute prejudice, and you can do little or nothing about it because they're going to use force and whatever other means and call it justified somehow. Whether they remove your kids or whether they take your property or whether they incarcerate you or whether they kill you. At which point, hey, where'd your rights go? So yes, I would theoretically I believe in the idea of human dignity and a certain agreement that there's things we won't do as a society or as a community. I think that's a pretty important thing, and I believe that the Constitution is a good start, though I disagree with certain aspects of it. And so I have a tendency towards constitutionalism as a preference to anarchy, because I'm not an anarchist either. I understand that anarchy is self-destructive. It may or may not be the natural state, but it's self-destructive. True anarchy doesn't last long. Sooner or later, a strong man shows up who creates it and turns anarchy into totalitarianism. And under those circumstances, it doesn't matter is that the anarchy cannot organize itself to resist totalitarianism. So anarchy is an invitation to totalitarianism, and I'm not in favor of totalitarianism. So I'm not in favor of anarchy because the one becomes the other. And of course, most people who use the word anarchy actually mean communists, and I'm absolutely not a communist. Though admittedly, true anarchy, communism is the exact opposite of true anarchy. Even though most people, when they say anarchy, they mean communists. So, I don't really have a side. That's actually not a great strategy going forward. We are now going to see people break into gangs. We are going to see people stand up and try to defend their communities, defend their territories, cut out their own territories, as Antifa has done in Seattle. They're going to start trying to cut out an area that they will defend. Yes, they will extort the business owners and people who live there for money so that they can survive. That's going to be the only way they really can survive. And so they're going to do that. That goes back hundreds of years. That's the beginnings of the Sicilian Mafia. Was the exact same sort of situation that we find ourselves in increasingly now. The question is, can any of these groups actually survive? And that is a really good question, which the current answer is no. None of them are set up to actually survive. They'll all go warlording, but none of them are actually set up to survive. All of them will have to change and adapt and find new ways to express themselves in order to have any hope at survival. And they may succeed or they may fail. Most of them will fail. I mean, that's nature for you. You throw 1 million seeds into the wind and 100 of them turn into plants. So you throw 1 million factions out across the American countryside and a few hundred of them will actually take root and actually be able to survive. And who knows which ones they are. I mean, we can pretty well say that groups like Antifa, groups like the True Believer, communist intellectuals, pseudo-intellectuals, they will not survive because they're in no way in touch with reality. The ones who are most in touch with reality would be like the gangs, the Bloods, the Crips, the biker gangs, the cops, and so on. They're the most in touch with reality. And so largely they would actually tend to be, in my opinion, would probably tend to have the best chance of survival. And to some extent the constitutionalists, though, of course, to survive this time, you can't be truly egalitarian. You're going to have to be somewhat totalitarian. And so the constitutionalists will have to, recognize human rights and yet, somehow manage to reconcile that with demanding things of people that may or may not be in their interest. So, we'll see. We will see what comes. But it's not a good situation. Things are moving a little faster than I thought. We are now seeing the forming of and potentially already the destruction of institutional tribal level, which means effectively the government has collapsed. For all intents and purposes, effectively the government is in the process of collapsing, otherwise this wouldn't be happening. This also means that the authoritarians have not won, nor will they win, not unless they, Orton and the status quoers will have not won, nor will they win, unless one or both sides can exert enough force to demand order be restored. But even if order is restored, it is because confidence has been broken, it is unlikely that unity will be restored. In other words, peace may be restored, but underground there will be this black market as people all fight each other. So we have actually now seen financial, commercial, and political collapse. All have initiated. They're not complete. They may not be complete for some time to come yet, but they are now initiated and probably irrevocable at this point. And so now we're down to tribal institutional. And will we stop? Will we hold at tribal institutional? Will the government be able to reassert itself as it did in the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union lost commercial and it lost financial, commercial, and it almost entirely lost government, but it managed to reassert itself and reestablish itself at the governmental level before it completely descended into the mafioso, tribal way of doing things. And so they managed to stop their descent at that point. We could still, theoretically, we might still be able to do that, but of course the full-scale economic collapse is still out there, and that's going to come in and as another a whammy. We also have the virus, which really puts a kibosh on things. I think the major takeaway of this is that it's already in process, and it would take a considerable change of the situation to try to return to any level of normalcy. Basically we're not returning to normal. We are in the fourth stage. We are forming up the fourth stage of collapse now as we watch. And now there's another wave of the virus coming back, and there is, of course, all this civil unrest, which has to work its way through the system. And there's still the total 100% destruction of the financial system still out there ahead of us at some point. It does not seem very likely that we're going to endure. And, of course, at some point here, China wants to take over the whole damn show anyhow. So, it may well be factions fighting for and against China is what the future holds. Who's to say?